Abandoned as a child for reasons she never understood, Margaret returns years later with a hauntingly familiar face and a voice that captures the heart of every listener. But as her powerful performance stirs memories in an audience that includes the people who left her behind, questions arise. Will they recognize her? And if they do, what will she choose to reveal or to keep hidden forever? Hello, and welcome to our channel. Here, we share stories that tug at your heartstrings, each crafted with care to inspire, uplift, and leave a lasting impression. If you love heartfelt tales, please subscribe. Your support fuels our creativity and helps us bring even more touching stories to life. Join our community and let's journey together into unforgettable storytelling. Margaret was a girl with a heart of gold and the gentleness of a soft breeze. But there was something about her that her family, especially her parents, did not appreciate. Margaret had a unique look, unlike the children her parents hoped she would resemble. She had thick, bushy hair, wide-set eyes that sparkled with wonder, and a nose that was a little bigger than what they deemed acceptable. Margaret's parents, wealthy and well-known in town, only seemed to care about appearances. They wanted everything to be perfect, and that included their daughter. Unfortunately, Margaret didn't fit into their idea of perfection. No matter how kind and sweet Margaret was, her family always seemed to see only her outward appearance. Her parents barely spoke kindly to her, and her father would often sigh when he looked at her, while her mother would click her tongue, looking away as if Margaret were something she wished she could forget. Margaret noticed these things, but she tried not to let them hurt her too deeply. She told herself that if she was gentle and obedient, they would come to love her one day. She hid her sadness, and every night she would hug her favorite stuffed bear, whispering secrets and wishes, hoping that maybe, somehow, her family would change. One day, when Margaret was just 7, her parents made a decision that would change her life forever. They dressed her up in her best clothes, but they said nothing about where they were going. As they drove through the city, Margaret watched the trees and buildings pass by, feeling a strange sense of worry in her stomach. She reached for her mother's hand, but her mother only pushed it away gently, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. After a long drive, they arrived at a large building she'd never seen before. It was cold and plain, with tall fences and a small faded sign that read Starlight Children's Home. Margaret looked at her parents, confused. She tugged on her mother's coat, trying to get her attention. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her parents looked at each other, avoiding her gaze. Her father cleared his throat and said, "We can't afford to keep you anymore, Margaret. You'll be better off here." His voice was cold, distant. Margaret's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what he meant. Weren't they a family? Weren't they supposed to be together? Her mother stepped forward, handed her a small bag with a few of her belongings, and gave her a forced, awkward smile. "This will be your new home now, Margaret. Be a good girl," she said, her voice lacking warmth. Margaret felt her world shatter in that moment. She reached out to her mother one last time, but her mother quickly stepped back, as if Margaret's touch was something she couldn't bear. They turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing on the cold steps of the children's home, clutching her favorite stuffed bear tightly in her arms. Tears filled her eyes as she watched her parents get into their car, her father barely glancing back as they drove away, disappearing down the road without a second thought. Margaret stood there, alone, feeling a wave of confusion, hurt, and abandonment wash over her. She didn't understand why her parents had left her, why they had stopped loving her. All she knew was that something inside her felt empty and broken. She sat on the steps, hugging her bear tightly, her tears falling silently, one after another, onto the cold stone beneath her. In that moment, Margaret's life changed, and though she didn't know it yet, this painful beginning would be the start of a journey that would test her strength, kindness, and the unbreakable spirit hidden inside her. Margaret's life at the Starlight Children's Home was different from anything she had known. Although the staff was kind and the other children tried to make friends, Margaret often felt like she didn't quite fit in. The sting of her parents' abandonment lingered, creating a sadness inside her that seemed impossible to heal. Every now and then, she would sit by the window, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, and wonder why her parents had left her behind. Was there something wrong with her? These thoughts haunted her, making her feel small and unworthy. But as time passed, Margaret began to grow and adapt. She discovered new things about herself. She loved books, devouring each story with a hunger for escape and adventure. When she wasn't reading, Margaret found comfort in painting, creating images that reflected her dreams and emotions. And when she was feeling especially sad, she would sing, her soft voice carrying a bittersweet melody through the halls of the children's home. It was in these moments that she began to feel a flicker of happiness, a small sense of belonging in the art she created. Despite the kindness of the staff and the friendship of the other children, Margaret's self-confidence was shaky. She still carried the feeling of being unwanted, a shadow that darkened her brightest days. Sometimes, she would overhear other children talking about their families, or she would see parents coming to adopt some of the younger children, and her heart would ache. She tried to keep her hope alive, wishing that one day her parents might come back for her. One day, Margaret's life changed when she met Mrs. Collins, an older woman with a warm smile and gentle eyes who volunteered at the children's home. Mrs. Collins took a special interest in Margaret, sensing the loneliness that lingered behind her kind eyes. She would sit with Margaret for hours, talking about life, stories, and the importance of inner beauty. True beauty, Mrs. Collins would say, comes from kindness, strength, and a heart that knows love and forgiveness. With time, Mrs. Collins became like a mother to Margaret, showing her patience, love, and understanding that she had never known. Through Mrs. Collins's gentle encouragement, Margaret began to believe in herself. She learned to see her uniqueness as something special rather than something to hide. With each lesson, each story, and each piece of wisdom shared by Mrs. Collins, Margaret's heart began to heal. As Margaret entered her teenage years, her talents blossomed. She had a unique beauty, an inner light that seemed to shine brighter with every day. Her voice, once timid and quiet, grew in strength and emotion. She poured her heart into every song, her voice capturing the feelings of love, loss, and hope that she had experienced. She continued to paint too, her artwork reflecting her journey from a broken-hearted girl to a young woman filled with resilience. Mrs. Collins saw Margaret's potential and encouraged her to enter a local singing competition. At first, Margaret was hesitant. She still had her doubts, and the thought of performing in front of strangers made her nervous. But Mrs. Collins's faith in her was unwavering. "You have a gift, Margaret," she said softly, "and the world deserves to see it." Taking a deep breath and gathering her courage, Margaret decided to enter the competition. When she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounded, and her hands trembled. But as she began to sing, all her fears melted away. Her voice filled the room, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that captivated everyone. By the time she finished, the audience was silent and then erupted into applause, moved by the beauty and raw emotion of her performance. Margaret's success quickly became the talk of the town. Reporters were eager to learn more about the talented girl with the mysterious past. Her face appeared in local newspapers, her voice reaching beyond the walls of the children's home. She could feel her world opening up, and with it, a spark of hope. Could this be her chance to find her parents? One day, Margaret received a letter that left her both curious and unsettled. It was an invitation to perform at a grand high society gala, an event hosted by the wealthiest socialites in the city. Margaret's talent and beauty had attracted attention, and the organizers were eager to showcase her. Little did Margaret know, the very hosts of this glamorous event were none other than her estranged parents. Her parents had risen in the social world, becoming famous for their wealth and influence. They were celebrated for their parties, their fashion, and their connections, but they had long buried any memory of the daughter they once left behind. In their minds, the past was gone, and with it Margaret. They saw her only as Margaret D., On the guest list, a name that meant nothing to them, a stranger with a mysterious allure. When Margaret read the invitation, a strange feeling gripped her heart. She felt an unexplainable pull, as if fate were leading her towards something important. Part of her was hesitant. She didn't feel comfortable singing for a crowd of people who might be just as shallow and judgmental as the parents who abandoned her. But deep down, there was a glimmer of hope. She couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to find answers. Perhaps this event would bring her face to face with the parents she'd lost. Margaret wrestled with her emotions. She felt angry at the thought of performing for people who valued appearances above everything else. But another part of her was filled with curiosity. Could she finally understand why her parents had abandoned her? Would seeing them again give her peace? Mrs. Collins noticed her inner struggle and gently encouraged her. "You may find something you're looking for," she said softly. "But remember, no matter what happens, you are loved and valued as you are." With her heart beating fast, Margaret decided to attend. She prepared herself carefully, choosing a simple yet elegant dress, her hair falling naturally around her shoulders. Mrs. Collins stayed by her side, a calm presence offering her silent support. Margaret felt stronger, knowing she wasn't facing this moment alone. When they arrived at the grand venue, Margaret's breath caught. The opulent hall was adorned with sparkling chandeliers, golden drapes, and guests dressed in glittering gowns and sharp suits. A part of her marveled at the beauty of it all, but she also felt out of place, as if she were stepping into a world she was never meant to belong to. As they moved through the crowd, Margaret spotted her parents from afar. They were mingling with other guests, laughing and smiling, wrapped in the luxury and admiration of their world. Margaret's heart twisted as she observed them. It was a strange, painful moment. She felt a rush of anger, sadness, and a longing she didn't fully understand. They looked so different, yet so familiar. Her mother's laugh echoed through the hall, a sound Margaret hadn't heard in years, a sound that once comforted her before it became cold and distant. Margaret's emotions swirled, and she almost turned away. But she knew she had come this far for a reason. She was determined to see it through. She watched her parents from across the room, her face a mix of calm and hidden turmoil. Did they even remember her? Would they recognize her face in the stranger she had become? The audience feels Margaret's suspense, sensing her fear and vulnerability, wondering if her parents would notice the connection or if she would stay hidden in plain sight. The night was just beginning, and with every passing second, Margaret's heart beat faster, caught between the pain of her past and the strength she had built on her own. Margaret stepped onto the stage. The soft spotlight illuminated her, making her glow like a star against the dark backdrop. She took a steadying breath, feeling the surge of strength rise within her. This was her moment, and for the first time, she felt truly free. Freed from the shadows of her past and the burden of seeking her parents' approval. Margaret lifted her gaze, allowing herself a brief glance at the crowd. Her parents were seated near the front, but they hadn't recognized her yet. To them, she was just another performer, a beautiful, talented young woman with a voice worth listening to. As she began to sing, her voice filled the hall, rich with the emotion she had carried all these years. It was a song about love, loss, and finding oneself, a story she knew well. Every note she sang, every word she uttered, was a piece of her heart laid bare for all to hear. The audience was captivated, watching in awe as Margaret's voice soared, full of grace and power. Her mother leaned forward, mesmerized, while her father watched with wide eyes, clearly struck by the talent and beauty of the girl on stage. But it was halfway through the song that something shifted. Margaret's mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes narrowing, as if piecing together a distant memory. Her father's expression froze, his brows furrowing, realization dawning on his face. There, under the lights, they saw her, their daughter. The ugly girl they had abandoned had transformed into a beautiful, confident young woman who commanded the stage. Shock and horror rippled across their faces as they recognized the eyes, the unique features, and the quiet strength that had always been a part of her. They glanced at each other, whispering frantically, their expressions filled with disbelief, guilt, and something close to fear. The shame was unmistakable. The room seemed to hold its breath as Margaret's parents sat, forced to confront the choice they had made years ago. When Margaret's song ended, the audience erupted into applause, but she barely heard it. Her gaze was fixed on her parents, who were now standing, tentatively moving toward the stage. The applause faded as the crowd sensed the tension, watching with bated breath as her parents reached the edge of the platform. Margaret's mother spoke first, her voice wavering. "Margaret, I—" She hesitated, words failing her as she looked into her daughter's eyes that now held a depth and strength she had never taken the time to see. "We didn't know. We didn't realize." Her father cleared his throat, his voice low and filled with a tremor. "Margaret, you have to understand. We were young, foolish. We made mistakes." He searched her face for a sign of forgiveness, an indication that she might accept their remorse. We didn't know better back then. We're so sorry." They stumbled over their words, making excuses, claiming ignorance, trying to explain the unexplainable. Margaret listened in silence, her heart pounding, each word slicing through the memories of her childhood, the painful nights she spent wondering why they had left her. For so long, she had dreamed of this moment, imagined how it would feel to hear them say they were sorry. But now that it was happening, she felt strangely numb, as if she were standing outside of herself, watching the scene unfold from afar. They looked at her with pleading eyes, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would ease their guilt. Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She knew this was her chance to speak her mind, to say all the things she had kept buried for so long. "Do you have any idea what it felt like to be left behind?" Her voice was calm, steady, but her words carried a weight that silenced the room. "For years, I wondered what was wrong with me. I thought I was the problem, that I wasn't good enough or beautiful enough to be loved by my own parents." Her mother flinched, tears welling in her eyes, but Margaret continued, her voice unwavering. "I spent years building myself up, learning to love who I am without you. And now, here you are, wanting forgiveness, wanting to erase the pain with a few words." Her parents looked at her, lost, their regret so raw that it was almost painful to witness. "We know we can't change the past," her father murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But we want to make things right, if you'll let us." Margaret paused, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She could see the desperation in their eyes, the remorse they carried. Part of her wanted to let go, to forgive and move forward. But another part of her, the part that remembered the pain, hesitated. Her parents' faces fell, their hope dashed. Margaret took a step back, her heart both heavy and light, feeling the freedom that came with choosing herself over their approval. Finally, she spoke, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I appreciate that you're sorry," she said slowly, "but I don't need your approval or your love to feel whole. I found people who care about me, who love me for who I am." She glanced at Mrs. Collins, who smiled back, her eyes shining with pride. "That's all I need." The applause faded as Margaret looked down at her parents, who stood awkwardly near the stage, eyes wide with shock and remorse. They hadn't expected to recognize her, hadn't anticipated that the girl they abandoned would return in such a powerful, unexpected way. Margaret's mother looked stricken, her hand trembling slightly as she covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. Her father shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, struggling to find words that would somehow make up for the years of hurt they'd caused. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. For so long, she had dreamt of this moment, of standing before them as a strong, confident young woman. She had imagined her parents seeing her success, recognizing her worth, and feeling the weight of what they had lost. But now, standing there in front of them, she realized she didn't feel the satisfaction she thought she would. Instead, there was a heaviness in her heart, A quiet, aching sadness for the girl she used to be. The girl who had spent years wondering why she wasn't enough. Her mother took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling. "Margaret, we didn't realize. We didn't understand what we were doing. We were young, and we thought you'd be better off somewhere else. We didn't know." She trailed off, her words fumbling in the silence, her gaze pleading. Her father cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Margaret, we made mistakes, terrible ones. And if we could take it back, we would. We thought you were better off without us, and we didn't know how to be parents. We see now how wrong we were, and we're sorry. So very sorry." Margaret listened to their words, each one stirring a mix of emotions within her. She remembered the long nights in the children's home, clutching her favorite stuffed bear, wondering why her parents didn't love her. She thought of the empty ache that had followed her through her childhood, the moments of self-doubt, and the years it took to build herself back up. Now, they were here, asking for forgiveness, trying to erase the past with apologies and explanations. Margaret took a slow, steadying breath. She looked into their faces, her eyes clear and resolute. "Do you know how much it hurt?" she asked softly. Her voice was calm, but there was a strength in it that silenced them. "For years, I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought I wasn't good enough, wasn't beautiful enough to be loved by my own parents." Her mother's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her father looked down, guilt etched deeply into his features. But Margaret continued, her words unyielding. "I spent years learning to love myself, to find strength in who I am without needing your approval. I built a life filled with people who cared about me, who saw my worth." She glanced at Mrs. Collins, who was watching her with pride, her eyes filled with warmth and love. Margaret took a step back, feeling the weight of her decision lifting as she spoke her truth. "I appreciate that you're sorry," she said, her voice steady. "But I don't need your forgiveness to be whole. I found my worth without you, and I have people in my life who love me for who I am." Her parents' faces fell, their hope and expectation vanishing as Margaret's words sank in. She felt a bittersweet peace as she looked at them one last time, realizing that she didn't need their acceptance to feel complete. With one final glance, she turned and walked away, leaving them behind as she moved toward a future she had created for herself, one filled with love, strength, and the freedom to be who she truly was. Thank you for watching. We hope this story moved you and brought a little magic to your day. Don't leave without subscribing and letting us know where you're watching from, and share your thought in the comments. Your support means everything to us, and it inspires us to keep sharing more powerful stories with you.